Tonight, you're not doom scrolling or replaying tomorrow's conversations in your head. You re-standing in a Roman hallway at the soft edge of midnight, close enough to hear a latch click, close enough to feel sandal leather hush over tile, close enough to watch a lamp flame lean into a draft like it's listening to. Before you fall asleep, you'll see how Roman marriage can live inside routine more than ceremony, shared meals, shared beds, shared reputation. You will hear how unmarrying can be startlingly simple on paper, a sentence of intent said clearly enough to become a line the community can recognize. And you'll notice the quiet reason behind it all. Not romance, not thunder, but proof, because in Rome, shame and money like to follow endings. 3 small senses to keep you company: the latch's tiny metallic kiss, the faint scrape of a sandal turning a corner, the lamp's warm breath fluttering once, then steadying. Something nearby keeps time a slow, obedient drip in the courtyard cistern, counting seconds like it's counting witnesses. If your breathing starts to follow it, perfect. Inhale 4, exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing only if you enjoy calm, story-shaped history. And if you leave a comment telling me where and what time you're listening from, I'll heart a few and pin one. It helps the channel, and it helps me picture the quiet rooms the story is reaching. Because tonight, a story doesn't begin with a courtroom or a scandal shouted across a forum. It begins with a door, not a chain, and a single sentence spoken softly enough not to wake the house, yet clear enough to change who belongs on which side of the threshold. You might not expect the end of a Roman marriage to sound like someone returning a borrowed cloak before the shop closes. And yet, in the quiet parts of Roman life, the parts that smell faintly of lamp oil and warm stone, a relationship could sometimes be unmade with less effort than it takes to find your other sandal in the dark. Listen closely and you can almost hear it. A latch clicking, sandals brushing tile, a small draft leaning into a lamp flame as if the house itself is curious. Somewhere outside, the street is doing what Roman streets always do at night, being mostly quiet, but never fully asleep. Rome, for all its big speeches and marble confidence, did not always treat marriage as a sacred knot tied by thunder and priests. Often it treated it like a door that people walked through together, and sometimes, without ceremony, walked back out of. This is not to say Romans were cold. It is to say Romans were practical in a way that can feel oddly modern, like the kind of person who labels every storage jar in the pantry and then writes down the date the lentils were purchased. A marriage, in many households, was not a single dramatic moment. It was a routine. It was shared meals, shared beds, shared relatives, and the slow daily work of being recognized by other people as a unit. If the neighbors saw you as married, if the family treated you as married, if the household moved around you as if you were married, then in many cases you were married. The union lived inside behavior. In the way a chair stays yours because you always sit there and everyone quietly agrees not to argue about it. That is why Roman marriage can feel strangely flexible on paper. There were different forms and traditions, and some were more religious and rigid than others, but a great deal of ordinary married life, especially in later periods, sat in the social realm, where it could also be undone socially. Consent mattered. Household life mattered. Reputation mattered. And reputation, as you may know from even the calmest group chats, is both fragile and stubborn. It can be destroyed in 10 minutes and then remembered for 10 years. So Romans often tried to keep things legible. A marriage existed because it could be seen. And a separation, if it happened, needed to be seen too, in a quiet, controlled way. Not because they loved paperwork for its own sake, although some of them really did, but because they feared ambiguity. Ambiguity is like a slow leak in a roof. You don't notice at first, and then one morning everything smells faintly of damp wood. There is a famous idea in Roman divorce that floats around like a neat little proverb. The marriage could end with a clear statement of intent, sometimes summarized as take your things and go. The Latin phrase often associated with it is blood enough to feel like someone closing a ledger. Res tuus tibi habedo, meaning in spirit, keep your things to yourself or have your things. It is not romantic. It is not lyrical. It is ramang. It focuses on what can be proven. A sentence is important because a sentence can be repeated. It can be witnessed. It can be remembered by people who are very proud of their ability to remember things. And the Romans, living in a world where memory was social power, valued words that could be carried around like small, solid objects. If you can say, this is when it ended, then the community has a line to stand on, before, after, inside, outside, door open, door shut. If you're thinking, that sounds too easy, you're not wrong, but you're also not fully right. Rome had an obsession with simplicity that often hid complexity behind it like a curtain. Ending a marriage might be simple in theory, but life has a way of dragging chairs across the floor and making the simple sound complicated. A marriage could end quickly, but the consequences, property, status, children, social alliances did not always fold neatly into a basket and leave without bumping into the doorway. Still, the act itself could be framed as clean. And clean is calming, even when it isn't kind. There's something almost bedtime friendly about the idea of law trying to turn messy feelings into tidy categories. Like someone arranging blankets and insisting everything is fine because the blanket is straight. So when a couple unmarried themselves, they often cared about witnesses, tokens, and proof. Not because they wanted drama, they wanted the opposite. They wanted clarity so neither side could later pretend the break never happened, or happened differently, or happened in a way that made them look worse. Romans knew that shame and money have long memories, and that both of them enjoy returning at inconvenient times. Sometimes a message was delivered by a trusted person. Sometimes there was a spoken declaration in front of witnesses. Sometimes a record was kept by family. Sometimes it was as simple as moving out, but even moving out can be theatrical when the neighbors are paying attention through a crack in the shutters. Proof could be small, a note, a sealed tablet, a formal statement repeated by the right people. Even the choice of messenger could matter, because in a world where your social network is mostly human beings who physically walk places, the messenger is part of the message. You can imagine the scene without much effort. The house is dark, but not fully. The lamp is turned down low, making the corners soft and forgiving. Someone clears their throat very quietly, not because they are emotional, but because throats do that when a room is too still. A witness sits there trying to look neutral, which is difficult, because humans are not naturally neutral objects. They are more like chairs that squeak when you don't want them to. A sentence is spoken, not shouted, not sung. Just spoken, something about intention, something about separation, something about things belonging to the person who owns them. And then perhaps a small pause, because even the most practical legal moment still has to share space with the fact that two people used to share breakfast. The Romans liked procedures that protected them from future accusations. That was often a real fear. Not heartbreak, not even loneliness, though those existed, but the slow, grinding fear of being dragged into disputes later, when the details have gone fuzzy and the witnesses have become inconveniently dead or moved to a different neighborhood. The calm procedure is a shield. It says, we did this properly. We did it in front of people. We did it in a way that the community can recognize. It's the ancient version of taking a photo of the rental apartment before you move out, just in case someone later claims you cracked the sink with your mind. Law, in this sense, is not always about justice. Sometimes it's about avoiding unpleasant surprises. And then, quietly, we arrive at the dowry, which is where Roman marriage stops being a door and becomes a filing cabinet. The dowry dos was the quiet heartbeat of many marriages because it connected affection to contracts and inheritance. It was money, property, goods, sometimes land, sometimes slaves, sometimes just a carefully measured contribution meant to support the household. It was also, in a strange way, a kind of social glue. Families didn't only marry people, they exchanged stability. A dowry helped a new household function, and it made the marriage harder to treat as a casual whim, because now there were sums and objects that needed accounting. In Rome, romance could be real, but it often lived next door to arithmetic. Ending a marriage, then, meant negotiating what returns, what stays, and what counts as misconduct. Even a midnight divorce could be followed by daylight arguments over clothing, household items, and obligations that suddenly mattered more because the emotional reason to tolerate them had evaporated. There were legal mechanisms about returning dowries, about deductions, about delaying repayment, about whether someone's behavior justified holding part of the dowry back. It's all wonderfully tedious, the kind of detail that can make your mind wander gently away. Imagine two people who once shared a bed now indirectly discussing the value of a set of dishes, or whether a particular servant technically came as part of the dowry or was acquired later, or whether a certain piece of land was for the marriage or merely near the marriage. Rome could be dramatic, but it could also be painfully mundane, and the law often encouraged mundanity as a form of control. It's oddly soothing, in a sleepy way, to think of how much human life has always been spent on these quiet negotiations. You can picture wax tablets and seals, little impressions made by rings, the soft press of a signet into warm wax like a fingerprint that tries to sound official. You can imagine someone counting, not coins exactly, but obligations. Someone saying gently, "This should be returned," and someone else saying equally gently, "Yes, but not all of it," and a witness blinking slowly because this is not what they dreamed of doing with their evening. If you are still awake by the time we reach the part where Romans argue about dowries with the seriousness of people discussing the fate of the empire, feel free to subscribe. But honestly, don't strain yourself. The empire will survive. The dowry will probably, eventually, be discussed again. Of course, even if the law allowed separation with relative ease, it was not equal. Rome did not have a single social experience. It had layers, like a cake that no one admits is dry. In elite Rome, divorce could be common, even strategic. Used to rewrite alliances and reset careers with the briskness of rearranging seating at a dinner party. A marriage could be a political link, and ending it could be political too. But the ease depended on protection, family support, wealth, and the ability to survive gossip. A person backed by a strong household could leave quietly because they had somewhere to go, and people willing to stand beside them and say, "This is fine." A person without that shield could be swallowed by social consequences that were heavier and uneven. The law's simplicity could hide a reality that was not simple at all. And then there is the fact that Roman life was public in a way that makes modern privacy feel like a luxury item. Homes were busy. Households were full of people who noticed things. Servants noticed the way a tone changes. Neighbors noticed when someone stops appearing. Friends noticed when invitations stop arriving. Even if a separation happened at night, its echo could appear in the morning like footprints on a swept floor. The house was a stage. The atrium, the doorway, the shared spaces, these were places where reputation lived. A quiet divorce was often only quiet in volume. It still made ripples. It still rearranged the map of social relationships, and the map, as maps tend to do, remembered what had been drawn on it. Think about how a household would shift. Rooms change. Keys move. Routines break like dry reeds. Not in a dramatic snap, but in a series of small adjustments that make the air feel different. Someone's cup is no longer placed where it used to be. Someone's name is no longer used casually. Someone's familiar sandals are no longer by the door. These are the details that actually create the sensation of an ending. Rome may have loved legible sentences, but the body understands change through objects and habit. The law might say, "We are done," and the household might respond, "Yes," but the chair is still warm. Sometimes the split was peaceful, sometimes bitter, sometimes simply practical. But even practical emptiness has a sharpness to it, like the clean edge of a newly cut papyrus sheet. Rome allowed fast endings, which meant people could remarry quickly, at least in theory. The social world moved on, alliances shifted, new households formed. It's tempting to imagine this as emotional whiplash, but Rome was not always in the business of honoring emotion publicly. It was in the business of managing appearances and obligations. The emotional dust didn't settle on command. The law could close a door in one moment, and yet the mind might keep hearing it click in memory, especially at night when the house is quiet enough to make small sounds feel large. In that way, Roman practicality does not erase human softness. It just wraps it in procedure and hopes it will behave. So let's end where the lamp is low again, because this is bedtime, and Rome, for all its noise, had countless quiet rooms. Imagine the final scene. The sentence spoken without shouting, the air suddenly cooler, not because the weather changed, but because the household has changed shape. A witness nods, not dramatically, but in the way people nod when they want to confirm they are paying attention, even though their mind is drifting towards sleep. Someone ties a small pouch shut because Romans loved containers. Pouches, boxes, tablets, little places where you put things so they can stop being loose in the world. Hold the thought that simple does not mean painless. It only means legible to law. Let that last feeling soften, a choice made, a boundary drawn, tomorrow already waiting outside the door as patiently as a street that has seen everything. The street stays silent. The latch holds. The lamp flame leans slightly in its draft, steady and unhurried, as if it has witnessed many sentences in many rooms. And somewhere in the distance, this city continues to be a city without making a point of it. Names will be spoken tomorrow in new combinations. Keys will move again. But for now, it is only the quiet and the warm stone and the ordinary. Roman miracle of turning messy life into tidy words and letting the tidy words sit there for a moment like a folded cloth placed carefully on a table while the night keeps going and you very gently do not have to. You might not expect a government to look at a perfectly innocent square of glass and think calmly and logically, yes, that is clearly where the money is hiding. And yet, for a long stretch of British history, daylight itself became a small financial problem, counted in rectangles, measured in frames, and occasionally punished with bricks. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. Rain ticking on a sill, a distant carriage wheel smoothing out on wet stone, and a soft little draft that keeps trying to enter a room like a polite visitor who refuses to take a hint. And before we begin, in the gentlest possible whisper, where and what time are you listening from? In the late 17th century and beyond, Britain experimented with a simple idea that sounds tidy on paper and slightly strange in a real house. Instead of asking everyone directly how much they earned, the state could look at something visible and countable. Like windows. A home with many windows looked like a home with money. A home with fewer windows looked like a home that sighed before buying candles. So the window tax arrived, and suddenly architecture became a kind of quiet confession. A wall was no longer just a wall, it was a statement. A window was no longer just a window. It was a little glowing announcement that said, we can afford light, and we are apparently willing to pay for it. The logic had a certain sleepy neatness. It's easier to count windows than to measure someone's secret income, especially in an age when people were not thrilled about sharing their finances with enthusiastic officials. Windows sat there, visible and unblinking, like the eyes of a building that can't pretend it's asleep. And of course, once something is counted, it becomes a target for creativity. Humans, throughout history, have been remarkably consistent about one thing. If you attach a cost to a normal habit, they will immediately begin to redesign the habit. Sometimes with elegance, sometimes with desperation, and sometimes with a particular kind of stubborn cleverness that produces awkward solutions nobody truly enjoys, but everyone respects a little. At first, it may sound almost harmless. A tax on windows. It's not a tax on bread, not a tax on your shoes, not a tax on the number of times you blink during prayer. It's just windows, except windows are how rooms breathe. They are how daylight enters. They are how you check the weather without committing to the weather. They are how you notice your neighbor doing something mildly suspicious with a chicken. They are, in other words, the quiet infrastructure of ordinary life. And the moment you make windows expensive, you don't just change tax policy. You change how people live inside rooms. It also changes how people feel about light. Light becomes faintly a luxury item. Not in the dramatic sense, where everyone is plunging into gothic darkness and composing tragic poems about the sun. More in the practical sense, where you stand in a hallway at noon and think, with mild irritation, this hallway could be brighter, and then you remember the government is involved. It is a little like realizing your phone battery is low and the charger is in another room, except the charger costs money every year and the room is your own house. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't, I'll never know, and the windows certainly won't tell me. They are busy being counted in the imagination of a tax collector who has never met a curtain he truly trusted. Once a window becomes a taxable unit, the next question is unavoidably boring and therefore extremely powerful. What counts as a window? This is where things get deliciously tedious. Is it the opening, the glass, the frame? If a window is bricked up but still outlined, does it count as a window or as a memory of a window? If you have a small window that looks like it was designed for a cat with ambitions, does it count the same as a large bright one that makes a whole room feel honest? Governments like clarity, buildings like variety. People caught between them often choose loopholes. The counting itself could become a quiet performance. Imagine an official arriving with the energy of someone who enjoys lists. He walks around the exterior. He looks up, he points, he counts, he writes. Somewhere inside, someone stands very still, hoping the official doesn't notice the tiny side window that was added last year, the one that makes the pantry feel less like a cupboard for haunted potatoes. Because that is the thing about taxes based on visible features. You develop a very personal relationship with visibility. You begin to see your own house the way the state sees it, which is rarely flattering. The state does not see your home as cozy. It sees it as measurable. So people responded by negotiating with their own walls. They reduced windows. They sealed them. They redesigned homes so that what was once normal light became optional light. In some places, the evidence is still there. Rows of bricked up window spaces like a face with its eyes politely closed. They're often called blind windows, which is an oddly gentle term, as if the building merely doesn't want to look at you today. Sometimes the brickwork is neat. Sometimes it's rough. Either way, it is a visible record of someone doing math and deciding that daylight needed to be downsized. And here comes one of those small historical absurdities that feels both silly and entirely believable. A tax meant to quietly capture wealth could end up shaping the health of ordinary people because when you reduce ventilation and sunlight, you make rooms damper, darker, and generally more enthusiastic about mildew. You don't have to imagine Victorian horror. You can just imagine a modest room where the air stays a bit too still, and the wallpaper quietly regrets its own existence. This is not dramatic suffering. It's the slow discomfort of living in spaces that feel slightly wrong because policy has gently leaned on the design of the house. It's also a wonderful example of how law tries to be rational and accidentally becomes aesthetic. Entire streets gained a certain look, fewer openings. More blank stretches of wall, a kind of quiet heaviness. It's like when a modern apartment building is designed around parking requirements, and you can feel the cars and the shape of the structure even when no cars are present. A window tax leaves its own ghostly fingerprint, except the ghost is made of bricks and mild resentment. Now, of course, not everyone responded the same way. Wealthier households could afford to keep their windows and complain about it at dinner, which is a traditional way of processing inconvenience. Poorer households might make harder choices. And even within the same town, you could see differences in how people negotiated with light. Some buildings stayed bright, some became dimmer. Some looked like they were trying not to be noticed. It creates a small, quiet map of inequality, drawn not in coins, but in glass. And because humans can't resist making a system social, the window tax also fed into reputation. A house with many windows could be admired as grand or muttered about as wasteful. A house with few windows could look humble or suspicious or simply uncomfortable. If you think of windows as a kind of facial expression for a building, then the tax encouraged a very specific expression: reserved, tight-lipped, and faintly annoyed. The truly sleepy part, though, is how this becomes a chain reaction of tiny decisions. A person doesn't usually say, "I will now live in darkness to defy the government." They say, "We can close that one window in the stairwell." Then they say, "Perhaps we don't need the extra pain in the back room." Then they say, "We will simply not renovate." And then one morning, a child grows up in a home where sunlight is more of a rumor, and nobody thinks to blame a policy that was designed in a distant office by someone who probably slept in a room with plenty of windows. The workarounds were sometimes inventive in their own quiet way. People used curtains more heavily. They rearranged rooms so the most used spaces got the available light. They created interior rhythms that followed daylight wherever it could be found, like plants leaning toward a window even when they're pretending not to. And for those who could afford it, there were architectural compromises keeping the appearance of wealth while managing the tax burden, or building in ways that obeyed the rules while still sneaking in comfort. The law says window, and the human mind says define window, and then the house becomes a vocabulary lesson. All of this turns architecture into a kind of soft legal document. The building is not just shelter, it is negotiation. It is compliance mixed with quiet resistance. It is a conversation between brick and bureaucracy held over decades, in the calm tone of people who are too tired to argue loudly but still refuse to agree fully. It's the historical equivalent of someone following an annoying workplace rule with perfect obedience, but in a way that makes the rule look ridiculous. Nobody is shouting. They are just breaking up a window with tremendous patience. As time passed, criticism of the window tax grew, because eventually someone always points out the obvious. Taxing light encourages darkness, and darkness is not a public good. You don't need to be a poet to see that. You just need to have stood in a damp room and wondered why the air feels heavy. But the machine of policy doesn't stop quickly. It slows, it debates, it collects reports. It listens to complaints that arrive in the form of letters, speeches, and the gentle coughing of people who live in rooms that don't quite breathe. And even when the tax is eventually removed, the bricked-up windows don't magically reopen themselves. Buildings are loyal to their past. A wall once filled in tends to stay filled in, unless someone has money, motivation, and a fondness for dust. So the afterlife of the tax lingers in the physical city. You can walk past it without noticing, and then once you notice, you can't unnotice it. A rectangle of different brick, a faint outline. A window-shaped absence. It is like seeing a scar on an old tree trunk, and suddenly realizing the tree had a whole earlier life that your eyes simply never asked about. There's something very bedtime-friendly about that, actually. The idea that the past sits quietly in ordinary places, not as a grand monument, but as a slightly mismatched patch of brickwork. Not a dramatic lesson, just a leftover decision. Someone once did math here. Someone once decided that a little square of light costs too much. Someone once chose darkness, not out of romance, but out of budgeting. And now you can still see the shape of that choice in the wall, long after the people are gone, long after the officials have stopped counting. Imagine for a moment a household on a calm night. The lamp is on, because of course it is. The lamp flame makes a small, steady effort to exist. The air is a bit still. The family has arranged itself around warmth and habit. Nobody is thinking about the window tax right now, because nobody thinks about the window tax at bedtime unless they are unusually dedicated to boredom, which, to be fair, is the entire purpose of this series. But the tax is there anyway, and the architecture and the room shape, and the direction the chair faces, because that is where the last bit of daylight used to land. History is not always remembered. Sometimes it is simply lived inside. And now, if we drift toward the soft end of this, let the last image be gentle. A street with buildings that look slightly more closed than they might have. A quiet row of facades, some bright, some reserved. A bricked up window that sits there like a sealed envelope nobody plans to open. The night air outside is cool, and inside, the lamp burns low, making the corners of the room blur into kindness. The government is not in the room, at least not in person. It's only present as an old idea, left behind in brick and shadow. Let the thought settle that policies don't always end when the law ends. Sometimes they remain as shapes. Sometimes they remain as habits. Sometimes they remain as the way a building refuses to let the night be interrupted by too much mourning. The rain keeps tapping. The street stays quiet. The house holds its warmth carefully, like a hand around a small cup. And the dark, instead of feeling dramatic, feels simply ordinary. The kind of ordinary that invites sleep. The kind of ordinary that doesn't need a conclusion. Just a soft drift as the lamp dims a little more, and the old bricked up rectangles keep their secrets without effort, while you very slowly don't have to keep yours awake. You might not expect a marriage to end the way a quiet door closes. Not with a crash, not with an audience, but with a latch clicking sandals soft on tile, and a lamp flame, leaning a little sideways in a draft that has been wandering around the room like it forgot what it came in for. Ancient Rome, for all its monuments and speeches, could be strangely practical about certain domestic things. And before we drift into that practicality, in the smallest whisper, where and what time are you listening from? In Rome, a marriage could be less like a sacred chain and more like a social habit that everyone agreed to recognize. That sounds cold when you say it quickly, so we won't say it quickly. We'll say it the slow way, like someone describing bread cooling on a board. A couple became real through the steady, ordinary proof of daily life. Shared meals, shared rooms, shared routines, shared reputations. Neighbors saw you together. Family treated you as together. The household learned the choreography of together, which includes tiny things like which cup belongs to whom and who gets the warmer side of the bed when the night air sneaks in. In some forms of Roman marriage, especially later on, a woman could remain legally tied to her birth family rather than being folded entirely under a husband's legal authority, which made marriage feel, in a very Roman way, both intimate and administratively flexible. It's not romantic, it's just legible. Rome loved things that could be proved, and this is why separation could feel oddly simple on paper. If marriage is partly a social reality, an arrangement lived out in public and confirmed by habit, then ending it can also be done socially by reversing the public signals. You stop sharing a household, you stop showing up as a pair, you stop letting the neighborhood write your story for you. The household itself begins to behave as if the union no longer exists, which is a quiet but powerful kind of proof. It's like changing the name on a shared calendar, except the calendar is your entire street, and everyone is extremely nosy in a calm, slow way. Of course, Rome did have ceremonial marriages too. There were old-fashioned rites and formalities, and certain priestly families treated marriage like something you handled with special care. The way you'd handle a hot dish. But even then, the daily practice mattered. Rome was not a culture that trusted pure feelings to hold up under cross-examination. It trusted witnesses. It trusted patterns. It trusted what a household looked like from the outside. And it trusted paperwork when it could get it, because paperwork is simply gossip that learned to sit still. If you're still awake by the time we reach dowry accounting, first impressive, second unnecessary, feel free to subscribe. But honestly, don't strain yourself. The Romans would have admired your discipline and then immediately asked for a witness to confirm it. Now we come to the famous part, the bit that feels almost too neat, like a line someone wrote because it sounded good in a courtroom. Roman tradition preserves blunt phrases associated with ending a marriage short, clear statements that draw a line the community can recognize. Sometimes later writers mention formulas along the lines of keep your things a sentence that has the emotional warmth of a tax receipt. The point is not poetry. The point is intention. Roman law and Roman social practice both cared deeply about whether a change could be demonstrated as deliberate. A clean statement, said in the right context, could act like a hinge turning. Before married, after not married. It's like flipping a wax tablet to a new page. Same tablet, different story. But even when the idea is simple, people still worry about the mess around it. Because endings attract arguments the way open food attracts flies. You never really said it. You said it, but you didn't mean it. You said it, but nobody important heard it. You said it, but you took the good blanket. This is where Rome becomes quietly procedural. You can end the relationship with a sentence, yes, but you often want the sentence to land on something solid. Witnesses tokens a messenger who can later swear he delivered the message and did not just stop for wine and forget. The goal is not drama. The goal is clarity. Clarity is the Roman version of comfort. So separation might happen at night, not because it's more romantic, but because night is when households are already closing doors and lowering voices. A trusted person might deliver the notice. A statement might be spoken in front of witnesses who can later repeat it with the bored accuracy of people who take civic duty seriously. Sometimes a written note on a tablet, on papyrus, in whatever form the family used for records, would sit quietly in the background as legal anchor. You can almost feel the Roman mind at work here, not how do we heal, but how do we prevent future claims that this never happened. Rome feared uncertainty the way a modern person fears losing their password. And while we're here, it's worth noticing how Roman life made privacy feel thin. Houses had servants. Houses had visitors. Houses had clients arriving at dawn, because Romans enjoyed the idea of sunrise, but didn't always enjoy sleeping through it. A household was porous. Things were heard. Things were noticed. This is inconvenient when you want to keep feelings to yourself, but very useful when you want proof. The same structure that spreads gossip also spreads evidence. Rome, in its own sleepy way, turned social surveillance into a legal tool. Then there's the dowry, which is where the quiet mechanics start to hum. The dowry dust was not just a romantic gesture. It was a financial artery connecting families, property, and expectations. It could include money, land, goods, sometimes even a carefully described set of household items that someone, somewhere, once counted and then never stopped thinking about. Ending a marriage often meant negotiating what returns, what stays, and what counts as misconduct serious enough to justify holding something back. The Romans had a talent for turning private life into categories, not because they were uniquely cold, but because categories are how you stop disputes from becoming endless, in theory. In practice, disputes still become endless. They just become endless with vocabulary. There were legal actions and customary expectations around dowry recovery, and the details could vary with time and status and the particular stubbornness of the families involved. The basic idea, though, remains beautifully unexciting. Property must be accounted for. If the marriage ends, the dowry is not meant to evaporate into the air like steam from a bathhouse. It is meant to be returned, or partially returned, or returned with deductions that someone will argue about in daylight. So yes, your midnight divorce might be followed by morning paperwork, which is a very Roman sequel. The sentence ends the union, but the accounting can last much longer, like a bell that keeps ringing softly after you've stopped striking it. And then we drift into the question of who could leave easily and who could leave at all. In elite Rome, divorce could be common, sometimes even strategic. Alliances shifted. Careers reset. Families reorganized their social map with the calm efficiency of people moving pieces on a board. It can look almost casual from the outside, which is unsettling in the way all casual power is unsettling. That the ease was not evenly distributed. Ease depends on protection wealth, family support, a place to go, and enough social standing that gossip bruises you but does not break you. A person with a strong household behind them can leave quietly. A person without that shield risks isolation, and Rome could be very good at isolating people without ever raising its voice. Even when the law allows an action, society decides how safe it feels. That's one of history's most consistent little jokes. The rule says you can do it. The neighborhood says, interesting choice, and then the invitations stop arriving. Or they arrive slightly later, with slightly less warmth. Or they arrive addressed to someone else. In Rome, reputation moved through networks like water through stone slowly, persistently shaping everything. A divorce might be lawful and still socially heavy, especially for women whose behavior was watched as a kind of public resource. And yet, precisely because Rome allowed fast endings, people could also remarry quickly. The city, in its practical way, kept the door open to new arrangements. It's just that the dust from the old arrangement didn't always settle on command. The house itself becomes a stage in all of this, because Roman domestic life was not fully private. The atrium could be a place of greeting and display. Servants moved through rooms carrying not only food and water, but also information, because information travels on feet. A separation might happen quietly at night, but its echo appears in the morning. A different arrangement of keys, a different pattern of footsteps, a different set of instructions given in a low voice. Friends choose sides with the soft inevitability of people selecting where to sit at a dinner party after an awkward argument. The household isn't only ending a relationship. It is renegotiating its place in a social map that remembers. And Rome remembered in small ways. A freedman who used to greet you warmly might now greet you politely, which is colder only if you pay attention. A neighbor who used to ask about your spouse might now ask about the weather with excessive sincerity. A relative might show up to help, which sometimes means helping and sometimes means counting silver. Nothing dramatic has to happen for life to feel rearranged. A door can close in one moment, and yet the mind keeps hearing it for weeks, like a latch that clicked a little too loudly. After the sentence is spoken, after the intention is made plain, the household shifts immediately. Rooms change function. Routines break like dry reeds. A cloak that used to hang in one place now hangs somewhere else, or disappears entirely, taking its familiar outline with it. The practical emptiness can feel sharp, not because anyone is weeping into pillows in a theatrical way, but because humans notice patterns, and the absence of a pattern is its own sensation. Rome's legal simplicity could make endings fast, but fast endings don't always feel light, they feel brisk, like stepping from a warm room into a cool corridor. Still, there's something almost soothing about how unromantic it all is. Not because love doesn't matter, but because the Roman system, at its calmest, tries to prevent chaos. It turns a potentially explosive social situation into a controlled procedure. It insists that the end be legible, that the community can recognize it, that future disputes have fewer shadows to hide in. You can imagine a Roman elder approving of this with a tired nod, not because he loves endings, but because he hates uncertainty. So let the last image be gentle. A lamp under a Roman ceiling, the flame turned low, the air a little cooler than before. The sentence has been spoken without shouting. The household is quiet, not as punishment, but as transition. Outside, the street stays silent, and that way streets sometimes do when everyone has finally agreed to sleep. Hold the thought that simple doesn't mean painless, it only means provable. It only means that law can point to a line and say, here, before and after. And law, like a sleepy bureaucrat, is satisfied when it can draw a line. Let the feeling soften, a choice made, a boundary drawn. Tomorrow, waiting outside the door like it always does, patient and unbothered, the latch holds. The night keeps the words, and if the historian in the corner kept murmuring, he could keep going for hours about dowry clauses, about witnesses who nodded at exactly the right moment, about sandals on tile and the faint draft that never stops wandering until the lamp dims further, and the details, lovingly pointless, finally blur into sleep. After the sentence is spoken, the house does not explode into drama. It does something much more Roman and much more exhausting in the long run. It begins to reorganize, quietly, immediately, as if the walls have been waiting for permission. A key ring shifts hands. A small bundle of clothing appears where it wasn't an hour ago. A servant learns a new route through the corridor, the way you learn a new path in your own kitchen after someone moves the cups. Nothing in the room is technically tragic, and yet everything is slightly annoyingly different. Like when you change the position of your pillow by 2 centimeters and your brain acts personally offended. The odd thing is how practical the emptiness can feel. Rooms don't mourn, they repurpose. A bed becomes mine instead of ours without needing a committee meeting. A chair that once held a familiar cloak now holds nothing, which is a surprisingly loud form of nothing. Even the small domestic habits start to loosen. Someone stops boiling water for 2 cups and makes 1 cup, which is a tiny legalistic kind of loneliness. If you listen closely, the house starts producing new sounds. 1 set of footsteps instead of 2, 1 breath near the lamp instead of a blended rhythm. In a city like Rome, where households are little ecosystems full of people passing through, the absence isn't silent. It's just redistributed. And because Rome liked proof, the household becomes proof all by itself. It's difficult to argue that a separation never happened when everyone can see the new arrangement. The doorkeeper knows. The neighbor's cousin knows. The neighbor's cousin's favorite barber knows. This is not because Romans were uniquely petty, though they had their moments. It's because the Roman world was built on being seen. Status was public. Family was public. Even privacy, when it existed, was basically a curtain that someone's hand might lift at any time, politely, as if checking the weather. If you're wondering whether this makes a midnight divorce feel less dramatic, the answer is yes. It's almost soothing in its dullness, but it also means the morning can be full of small, quiet negotiations. Not the shouting kind, the counting kind. Who keeps which bowl? Who takes which lamp? Who gets the good bronze mirror that reflects your face in a way that suggests you've been sleeping, which is not a common Roman luxury. And of course, hovering behind all of this, there is the dowry question again, waiting with the patience of a ledger. The marriage can end quickly. The accounting, like a slow animal, takes its time crossing the road. Sometimes the split is peaceful, in the way 2 people can agree that something is finished and then immediately become strangers who share a history like a borrowed tool. Sometimes it is bitter, but even bitterness in Rome often arrived wearing a formal outfit. Accusations could become organized. Friends could become careful. Family could become very interested in your side of the story, not because they love you, but because they love what your story implies about them. Divorce might be simple, but social life isn't. Social life is a bathhouse, warm, crowded, and full of echoes. And yet, Rome also allows quick beginnings after quick endings, which is another one of its strange comforts. People can remarry. Alliances can reset. Households can rebuild. The city, always hungry for order, prefers a new arrangement to a lingering fog. But emotions do not always follow the speed limit of law. A door can close in one moment, and the mind can keep hearing that latch for days. Not as heartbreak, necessarily. Sometimes just as memory doing what memory does, replaying a sound because it was part of the old routine. So let the last image stay quiet. A lamp under a Roman ceiling turned low. The flame leaned slightly because drafts have habits too. The sentence has already been spoken and it didn't need to be long. It only needed to be clear. It only needed to be witnessed, or at least believable, in that deeply Roman way where truth and public recognition sit uncomfortably close together. Outside, the street is calm. The stones hold the day's warmth for a little while longer. Somewhere far off, a night watchman exists mostly as a concept, because even watchmen at this hour are probably bored. Hold the thought that simple does not mean painless. It only means legible. It means the law can point at the moment and say, there, that was the boundary. And in the softest, sleepiest sense, boundaries can be comforting. They stop arguments from wandering forever. They let tomorrow arrive without having to negotiate with yesterday. The latch holds. The lamp dims. The household settles into its new shape, quietly, like wax cooling. And the night patient, unromantic, gently indifferent keeps the words, and then lets them drift until you don't quite remember the sentence at all. Only the warmth of the room and the slow, pointless details fading into sleep. You might not expect an entire Roman marriage to end the way a small household chore ends, with a latch clicking and a quiet hand deciding it is time to set something down. But in the Roman world, there were moments when being married was less like being welded together and more like being recognized day after day as a pair that belonged in the same doorway. So let's begin very gently, as if we were walking through a sleeping house. A latch clicks. Sandals hush on tile. A little lamp flame leans sideways in a draft, as if it is practicing the delicate art of not making a scene. And somewhere in the background, a city does what cities always do at night. It breathes, it settles, it forgets to be impressive. Where and what time are you listening from? You don't have to answer out loud. Rome won't grade you on participation, and honestly, Rome has enough paperwork already. In Rome, marriage could be a surprisingly practical arrangement, and that practicality was not always cold. It was just organized. If you imagine two people sharing a household, it is not only the big ceremonial moment that matters, but the slow accumulation of ordinary things, shared meals that become habitual, shared blankets that stop feeling borrowed, shared friends who begin to refer to your house as if it is one unit with one front door and one set of opinions about olive oil. A Roman marriage, in many forms, could be built out of consent and continued by recognition. It lived in daily practice, the way the household arranged itself around two adults, the way neighbors assumed you belonged together, the way a family might introduce someone as a spouse without needing to point at a priest, a temple or a scroll with a dramatic signature. A union could be real because everyone acted like it was real, which is a very sleepy and slightly unsettling idea, because it means the glue is not just love or law, but habit and witnesses and the quiet social pressure of people who notice what you do with your evenings. The Romans had several kinds of marriage and several ways of thinking about what marriage meant, but one of the important background notes is that, especially in later periods, marriage often leaned heavily on mutual intent. The relationship existed because both parties and the community around them treated it as existing. And if that sounds a little like a modern subscription you can cancel, please don't say that too loudly near a stern Roman ancestor. They would pretend not to understand what a subscription is, then immediately invent 3 legal categories for it: a tax and a small ritual involving incense. Still, the comparison is soft and useful. When something is sustained by ongoing agreement, it can sometimes be ended by a clear withdrawal of that agreement. Not because the Romans were emotionally minimalist, but because they loved clarity almost as much as they loved labels on jars. This is why the idea of a midnight divorce can feel both strange and strangely simple. Not always literal midnight, of course. Romans were practical, and also sometimes tired, but the image fits. The quiet hour, the small decisive moment, the statement made without trumpet blasts. Ending a marriage could, in some cases, be a matter of declaring that it is over. A sentence that draws a line the community can recognize, before and after. You might picture it like closing a door that has been left open for years. The famous blunt phrasing often associated with Roman divorce is not romantic. It is not poetic. It is more like a clerk clearing a desk. Take your things, we are done. Sometimes it is derived in a tidy phrase like res tuus tibi habedo, meaning, in essence, have your things for yourself. There is something almost aggressively practical about it, like the emotional equivalent of labeling 2 baskets, yours, mine. And yet that practicality is part of what makes it feel so quiet. No gods need to be persuaded. No dramatic courtroom scene is required just to acknowledge that 2 lives are no longer being run as one household unit. If you are still awake a little later, perhaps, by the time we reach the thrilling topic of how Romans proved that a message was delivered, you can subscribe. Or don't. In a way, not subscribing would be thematically consistent. Rome loved commitment, but it also loved the ability to say, calmly, actually, I will not continue this arrangement. Either way, the lamp will keep leaning into the draft, and the city will keep being a city, and the historian will keep mumbling gently about procedures. Of course, even when divorce could be simple in theory, Romans still cared about evidence because they were deeply interested in 2 things that never sleep: reputation and money. A clean ending is only clean if it is legible to other people. In a small household and in a larger social world, the danger is not only heartbreak. Rome does not talk about heartbreak the way later cultures do, but confusion. Confusion leads to arguments. Arguments lead to lawsuits. Lawsuits lead to people standing around in the sun listening to speeches, and that is not relaxing at all. So even a quiet divorce often came with careful attention to proof. Who said what when it was said? Whether it was said in front of the right people. Whether a trusted person carried the words from one party to the other like a sealed little parcel of intent. Witnesses mattered because witnesses are a portable memory. And Rome was a culture that treated memory as something you could bring to court, like a tool in your belt. A message could be delivered by a reliable intermediary. A declaration could be spoken in front of people whose names were worth something. Sometimes there might be written notices in later periods, though the details could vary, and not every household kept tidy paperwork like a modern office. But the goal was often the same: clarity that prevents later pretending. A divorce is, in a way, an attempt to stop the future from rewriting the past. The Romans knew that human beings can be very creative when it benefits them. They also knew that "I never said that" is a phrase that can destroy an afternoon. So they tried to anchor the ending in something public enough to stick. And then there are the tokens and the small physical facts that keep a marriage from being only a feeling. If marriage lives in the household, then the household itself becomes evidence. Who has the keys? Who controls the storeroom? Who has access to the slave's labor, to the accounts, to the pantry where the good honey is kept? Even the simple matter of where someone sleeps can become a tiny legal fact, like a breadcrumb trail for future arguments. The Romans were very good at turning ordinary life into categories. If a separation happened, it could be important to show that it really happened, that one person moved out, or that the household reorganized, or that certain shared routines stopped. This is all very unglamorous, and that is exactly why it is perfect for bedtime. Imagine falling asleep to the sound of sandals on tile, not because the sandals are running away in panic, but because someone is calmly relocating their household identity. The dowry is where the quiet mechanics become especially mathematical. A dowry to us was not just a romantic gift. It was a financial arrangement meant, among other things, to support the burdens of marriage and the household. It connected the personal to the contractual in a way that would make a modern spreadsheet feel seen and appreciated. When a marriage ended, the dowry often became a main subject of negotiation. What returns, what is kept, what deductions might be made, what counts as misconduct, and how quickly things must be repaid. The end of a relationship can be followed by a very long aftertaste of accounting. Even if the sentence ends the union, the money can take its time leaving the room. The rules around dowry could be complex and changed over time, but the basic tension stays familiar. One side might want prompt return. The other might want to delay, deduct, or claim justification for keeping part of it. And because Rome liked social order, it also liked having frameworks for these conflicts, even if those frameworks did not always produce fairness in the way we might hope. The dowry could be protected to some degree, but it could also be treated as something entangled with the household's ongoing obligations. The result is that a quiet divorce might feel quiet only in the moment of declaration. After that, it could turn into a slow administrative drizzle. Negotiations about clothes, jewelry, land, slaves, household goods, and the invisible value of maintaining or damaging someone's standing. There is also the gentle irony that, in a world where divorce could be relatively accessible, people still feared the social consequences. Because you can end a marriage with a sentence, but you cannot end gossip with a sentence. Gossip does not respect legal formulas. Gossip has no respect for witnesses. Gossip is the true empire. It expands, it occupies, and it never files proper paperwork. So Roman families often tried to manage divorce not only as a legal action, but as a reputational event. Quietness was sometimes a strategy, not a mood. If you keep the ending calm and controlled, maybe the neighborhood's imagination has less material to chew on. That is the hope anyway. Rome's imagination was rarely hungry in a polite way. As we drift into the larger social map, it helps to remember that divorce in Rome was not equal, even when it was easy. The law might allow endings, but society still judged who was allowed to end things without paying a different price. Elite men, for example, often had more room to treat divorce as strategic. A marriage could be used to form alliances, to connect households, to balance political relationships, and then, if necessary, to be rearranged when circumstances changed. This can sound cold, but it also reflects how Rome often thought. The household is not merely private. It is part of the public order. A marriage can be a tool, and tools are sometimes set down when another tool is needed. Very soothing, if you enjoy the quiet terror of human pragmatism delivered in a whisper. For women, divorce could be possible, but the consequences could be heavier, depending on time period, social status, and family support. A person backed by a strong family could leave more safely. A person without that shield could find themselves vulnerable to isolation and rumor. The same legal simplicity that makes divorce feel like a door also hides how uneven the hallway can be. Some people can walk out into another warm room. Others walk out into cold air and the long stare of neighbors who have opinions. And neighbors in Rome were often close enough to hear your household arguments through thin walls and open courtyards. Privacy was sometimes a luxury, and not everyone owned it. In elite circles, divorce could be common enough to feel almost routine, like rearranging seating at a dinner party, except with more paperwork and fewer figs. We know of prominent figures who divorced and remarried for political reasons, and of social norms that treated marriage and divorce as part of the dance of alliances. Yet even there, routine does not mean emotionally empty. It means socially navigated. People still cared deeply about honor, respect, and the appearance of control. A man might divorce and immediately remarry, but he would still want the story to sound reasonable. A woman might be divorced and remarried, but her reputation would be carried like a fragile jar, one crack, and everyone claims they always heard it was defective. And then there is the house itself, the Roman domus, which can feel like a stage even when no one is trying to perform. Roman life had a public quality that makes modern privacy feel thick and cushioned by comparison. Houses could have open atriums where visitors were received. Clients might come in the morning to greet a patron. Servants moved constantly, and servants were the world's most efficient information network. A divorce, even if declared in a quiet moment, would echo through the household the next morning as routines changed. Someone's place at the table shifts. Someone's keys are no longer on that hook. Someone's name is spoken differently by the cook, who pretends not to notice anything while noticing absolutely everything. Even the phrase midnight divorce suggests that night is when things can be said without an audience. But in a Roman household, there is almost always an audience of some kind, even if it is only the lamp, the draft, and the faint sound of someone sweeping. A separation might happen at night because the couple wants calm, or because it is the only time the household quiets enough for a clear sentence to be heard. Still, the next day arrives with daylight, and daylight is when consequences become visible. Friends choose sides, sometimes politely. Invitations stop arriving, sometimes without explanation. A spouse who leaves might find their social calendar becoming suddenly spacious, like an empty atrium. And a spacious atrium, while architecturally pleasing, can feel emotionally chilly. There is also the slow, sleepy absurdity of how much Roman society trusted surfaces. A couple might be considered real because they acted like a couple, and then they might become not real because they acted like they were no longer a couple. The social reality is performed, and the performance is taken as proof. It is like the world's most long-running play, where everyone is both actor and critic, and the reviews are delivered in whispers at the bathhouse. If that sounds exhausting, it is. But it is also wonderfully monotonous when described slowly enough. The historian, after all, is not here to provoke your adrenaline. We are here to let it drift downward, like the lamp flame leaning into that gentle draft. After the sentence is spoken, the household shifts in small practical ways. Sometimes the split might be calm, sometimes bitter, but the immediate feeling can be oddly administrative. Rooms change, routines break, schedules adjust. It can feel like reorganizing a storeroom after someone has moved out, except the storeroom contains memories and obligations and the faint smell of last week's wine. Rome allows fast endings in many cases, which means people could remarry quickly. And this is where the legal and the human quietly disagree. The law can move at a brisk pace when it chooses. The mind often does not. The mind keeps hearing the latch click. It replays the sentence, even if the sentence was plain and practical. And because Rome is Rome, the mind also worries about what other minds are saying about it. The new life after divorce could be shaped by social rank and by the resources that follow a person out the door. If a woman's dowry is returned, she might have financial stability, and her family might arrange another marriage. If it is delayed or disputed, she might be stuck in a limbo that feels less like romance and more like waiting for a slow cart on a dusty road. Men might feel freer to frame divorce as a reset, a new alliance, a new household arrangement. But even they could be bruised by reputation if the divorce looked dishonorable. Rome had a strong appetite for judging motives, and motives, inconveniently, are not always visible. So people filled the gaps with stories. Stories are cheaper than evidence. Stories are also louder, even when whispered. There were also moral expectations layered on top of legal possibility. Philosophers might have opinions about self-control, duty, and the stability of the household. Satirists might mock frequent divorce as fashionable chaos. Lawmakers at different times tried to regulate behavior through incentives and penalties, and the empire periodically worried about birth rates and family stability in the way large states sometimes worry about things they cannot fully control. So divorce was not only a private adjustment, it sat inside a wider atmosphere of what Rome thought a good citizen should look like. This is the kind of pressure that does not scream. It hums like the city at night. It is always there, like distant footsteps on stone. And yet, for all of that, the core image remained small, a lamp turned low, a sentence spoken without shouting, a decision made in the language of clarity. You might think simple means painless, but in Rome, simple often means legible. It means the law can see it. It means the community can recognize it. It does not mean the heart, if we allow ourselves that word, quietly stops being complicated. Rome did not always write tenderly about feelings, but feelings still lived in the gaps between procedures, like dust settling in corners the broom never quite reaches. So let the final scene be as quiet as the first. Imagine the household after the words. The night air is cooler near the doorway. The latch holds. Somewhere, a dog decides not to bark because it is too tired to participate in history. Somewhere, a servant continues sweeping as if sweeping can remove awkwardness from the floor. The lamp flame steadies, then leans again, then steadies, practicing its little dance with the draft. And you can hold the thought softly, without urgency, that a life can change with one sentence and still take many nights to feel settled. The street stays silent, the city exhales. The paperwork waits for morning, and the night, patient as ever, keeps the words, and then lets them fade into the same quiet it was using long before anyone decided to be married or unmarried or anything at all. You might not expect the fate of a whole community as peace to depend on the question of where the damp socks go. But in a medieval monastery, it sometimes did. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a sword and shield way. More in a quiet stone corridor way, where the air smells faintly of wax and boiled herbs, and the most thrilling sound is a bucket being set down with care. Somewhere a latch clicks. Somewhere a candle flame leans slightly, as if it too is trying to be obedient. And somewhere, in a place built for prayer and silence, a human being is thinking very patiently about laundry. If you're listening from a bedroom, or a bus, or a couch that has turned into a temporary bed, you already understand the basic shape of this topic. Cloth gathers. Cloth needs attention. Cloth, if ignored, becomes a quiet enemy. In monasteries, clothing was not only personal comfort, it was part of the uniform of belonging. A habit, a tunic, a hood, sometimes a scapular layers that said, without speaking, I am part of this rule, this rhythm, this small world. When you live among others under vows, the fabric you wear is not just fabric. It is a daily reminder that you are supposed to be humble, steady, and not particularly interested in personal flair. Which is funny, because nothing makes people think about personal flair quite like being told they were not allowed to have any. Monastic life was built around predictable cycles per hours. Meals, work, sleep, and the whole point was to keep the mind from bouncing around like a loose pebble in a pot. The schedule, in a way, was the soft fence that kept thoughts from escaping into chaos. Laundry slid into that schedule the way a small, unavoidable truth slides into any tidy philosophy. Clothes wear out. Bodies sweat, mud exists. And even the most spiritual person can become surprisingly less spiritual when their sleeves smell like last week's kitchen steam. The monastery did not pretend the body was not there. It simply tried to manage it quietly, with rules, routines, and an impressive ability to treat ordinary chores as moral exercises. Sometimes the rule of a community would say something about clothing, how much each monk should have, how often it should be replaced, whether it should be plain, whether it should be kept in common, whether personal ownership was allowed at all. The details varied across orders and centuries, but the general mood stayed calm and firm. You do not get to build a secret private empire out of spare shirts. You are here to pray, to work, and to be mostly the same shape as everyone else, which means laundry becomes communal by nature, even if everyone pretends they have no preferences. And they absolutely do have preferences. Even saints, if you give them a wet wool garment in winter, will quietly develop opinions. There is a specific kind of medieval practicality that shows up in the smallest things. Wool is warm but holds moisture. Linen is crisp but can be stubborn. Washing in cold water is a test of character. Washing in hot water is a luxury that requires fuel, and fuel is time, and time is supposed to belong to God. So the monastery's approach often involved balancing cleanliness with restraint, like a person trying to live minimally while also acknowledging that mildew exists. Some communities washed clothing at set intervals. Some relied on airing garments out, brushing them, beating dust out of cloth, and letting sun and wind do part of the job. It's a very gentle reminder that clean is a sliding scale, and the medieval world sometimes lived on a different part of that scale than your modern washing machine does. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. The monastery would probably approve of you not getting too attached to anything, including channels. But if you do stay, we're going to wander into the quiet mechanics. Who washed what counted as clean enough, and how an entire spiritual institution could be held together by people calmly supervising piles of cloth. The first thing to know is that monasteries were not always isolated little bubbles. Many had farms, workshops, guests, and steady interaction with the outside world. That means laundry was not only for monks. There were linens for altars, towels and cloths for kitchens, bedding for guest houses, work garments for fields, and then, inevitably, the endless cloth of daily life, napkins, aprons, ragged scraps used for wiping ink or oil. A monastery could produce holiness and cheese at the same time, and both required fabric. So the question becomes less, does a monk wash his robe? And more, how does a large household manage textile maintenance without turning into a damp chaos swamp? In many places, designated workers handled laundry. Sometimes monks did it as part of manual labor. Sometimes lay brothers, servants, or hired workers took on heavy washing. Sometimes the division depended on the order's strictness and resources. The work itself could be surprisingly physical. Washing cloth before modern detergents often meant soaking, beating, scrubbing, rinsing, wringing, and drying repeated until the fabric surrendered. Soap existed, but not always in the convenient forms you picture. Lye made from wood ash could be used to break down grease. Soap could be made from fats and alkaline substances, and not every batch was gentle. Some washing methods were basically polite chemical warfare on stains, with the cloth as the battleground. The monastery's environment shaped everything. If you're near a river, you have moving water, which is helpful. If you're not, you have to haul water, which is less streamy and more shoulder-based. Some places used wash houses or dedicated laundry areas. Some used large vats. Some relied on communal washing days when the weather cooperated. And the weather, as you know, has never signed a contract promising to be convenient. There's something softly comedic about imagining a careful, rule-bound community negotiating with rain. We will wash today, as planned. Rain, no. The monks, quiet sigh, patient adjustment, mild internal monologue about humility. Even proof exists in laundry because medieval institutions loved accountability, especially when property was shared. If clothing was issued from a common store, someone had to track it. Someone had to know whose robe was torn, whose sandals were worn thin, whose hood had mysteriously vanished in a way that suggested either theft or deep absent-mindedness. Monasteries often had officers, a cellarer managing supplies, a sacristan handling church items, and sometimes someone responsible for clothing and linens. In some communities, garments were distributed at set times like quiet, annual wardrobe events that no one called Fashion Week, because that would be sinful and also inaccurate. But the distribution itself could be recorded, supervised, and remembered, because institutions run on memory the way fires run on oxygen. And yes, in a world of silence and prayer, laundry still had social weight, not in a loud way, in the slow, sideways way. A monk with unusually clean clothing might look suspiciously comfortable. A monk with unusually filthy clothing might look suspiciously proud of suffering. Either way, people notice. People always notice. Even in a place dedicated to not noticing worldly things, human eyes remain attached to human faces. Cleanliness could be associated with order and discipline, but too much attention to it could seem vain. Neglect could be framed as humility, but also as laziness, or as disrespect for communal resources. The sweet spot was a calm middle, clean enough to be decent, plain enough to be humble, repaired enough to show responsibility, not polished enough to look like you're auditioning for sainthood through laundry. This is where the gentle absurdity really blooms. Imagine an earnest monk trying to purify his thoughts while also wondering whether his sleeves smell like onions. Imagine a novice learning the rule, learning the Psalms, and also learning that wet wool can smell like an animal having a complicated day. Imagine the quiet moral tension of wanting your tunic to dry faster without seeming impatient. It is the smallest drama, delivered in a whisper, and then immediately dismissed because the bell rings for prayer. As the laundry moves through its cycle, so is the monastery's social map. People have roles. Some are assigned to heavy labor. Some are assigned to study. Some are skilled at administration. Some are simply dependable at doing the same task for years without turning it into a personal tragedy. Laundry tends to land with the dependable. The kind of person who can rinse cloth 10 times and not feel offended by the concept of repetition. In a way, laundry is the perfect monastic task. It is humble. It is continuous. It requires patience, and it produces a visible result that no one is supposed to brag about. You cannot preach about how well you wash the linens. Or you can, but then someone will look at you in a way that makes you feel the full weight of your own ego, and you will quietly stop. There were also practical systems to extend the life of clothing because textiles were valuable. Cloth took time to produce. Wool had to be sheared, cleaned, spun, woven. Linen came from flax, which demanded its own labor. Dyes and finishing processes could be expensive, so monasteries often repaired garments until they were nearly more patched than original. This, again, is both spiritually pleasing and visually a little bit funny. A patched habit is a sermon you can wear. It says, "I am not here for beauty." It also says, "We are very good at not wasting things." And if you look closely, it says, "Someone is excellent at stitching while half asleep. Now drift with me into the quieter social edges, the way." Cleanliness intersects with reputation beyond the cloister. Monasteries often hosted guest travelers, pilgrims, sometimes nobles because hospitality was a serious religious duty. Guests meant beds, beds meant linens. Linens meant the potential for embarrassment if everything smelled like damp wool and boiled cabbage. So even the most spiritually focused community had to think at least a little about presentation. Not fancy presentation, just functional dignity. The kind of dignity where a visitor can sleep without feeling like they are borrowing a blanket from a barn. That creates a gentle hierarchy of fabric care. Altar cloths mattered, Eucharistic linens mattered, guest bedding mattered, everyday work garments mattered, but perhaps with less urgency. And in that hierarchy, someone had to decide what gets washed first when water is limited or the weather is uncooperative. These decisions are rarely recorded in dramatic chronicles, but they form the real texture of lived history, the constant small prioritizing that keeps an institution from fraying. If you want a modern analogy, think of a group chat deciding who brings what to a picnic, except the picnic is eternal salvation and the stakes are whether the towels are dry by Sunday. The monastery also existed in a landscape of ideas about purity, both spiritual and physical. Medieval Christianity had deep symbolic associations with washing baptism, purification, cleansing from sin. But that does not mean monasteries were obsessed with literal physical cleanliness in the modern sense. It means they were attentive to order, discipline, and symbolism. Water could be holy in one context and icy and miserable in another. A monk might contemplate spiritual cleansing while his hands are raw from lye, which is, if nothing else, an efficient way to remember humility. There is no faster route to modesty than realizing your skin is peeling because you were trying to remove grease from an apron. And then, quietly, you begin to see how a simple thing like laundry can reveal power and inequality, even inside a place built for equality of souls. Who does the washing? Who gets to avoid it? Who has the authority to assign it? In some communities, the heaviest labor might fall to lay brothers or servants, which means the monastery's smooth spiritual rhythm depended on people doing physical work in the background. That is not unique to monasteries. It is nearly universal in human history. The clean cloth appears, and someone's hands vanish from the story. But if you listen closely, you can hear those hands in the bucket, the ring, the slap of wet fabric, the slow creak of a line weighted with damp wool. After the washing comes the drying, which is, in its own way, a study in patience. Cloth must hang, cloth must wait, cloth must not be stolen by wind. Cloth must not be attacked by sudden rain, cloth must not freeze. Cloth must not be eaten by an ambitious goat. Medieval life is full of small enemies, and one of them is moisture that refuses to leave. Drying rooms, sunny courtyards, lines strung between stone walls, these become quiet theaters where time passes very slowly. A monk might walk past hanging habits and be reminded that everything takes time, even when you want it done. This is spiritually valuable and also mildly annoying, which is a combination the medieval world seemed to enjoy. Once garments are dry enough, they return to bodies, and bodies return to schedules. The bell rings, prayer happens, work happens, meals happen, and the whole point is that no one makes a dramatic speech about how the laundry turned out. The cloth is simply there, back in its place, as if it never had a separate life. But of course it did. Every garment had a journey, from sheep to thread, from thread to fabric, from fabric to tunic, from tunic to muddy sleeve, from muddy sleeve to wash fat, from wash fat to line, from line to back again. It is a cycle so repetitive it becomes calming. And that repetition, if you let it, can lull the mind into the same kind of gentle surrender that a monastery was built to encourage. So imagine the late moment after the busiest part of the day has passed. The lamp is lower now. The stone walls hold coolness. Somewhere faintly, you might smell the clean damp scent of linen that has almost dried, but not quite. A bucket sits upside down, resting. A line creaks softly as it settles under the last weight of cloth. The monastery is not trying to impress anyone. It is simply continuing quietly as it has done for years. The rules hold, the routines hold, the latch holds, and the laundry faithfully, stubbornly keeps returning because history is not only made of battles and speeches. Sometimes it is made of wet wool, ash soap, patient hands, and a community that stays together partly because someone remembered to rinse thoroughly. If you let your thoughts loosen now, you can picture a final small scene, A monk walking past the drying linens, not thinking anything heroic, just noticing that the cloth moves slightly in the draft. He does not pause for symbolism. Or maybe he does, but only for half a second, because the bell will ring again soon. And there is always another hour, another prayer, another quiet task. The city outside might be loud, the world might be restless, but here the night is calm, and the fabric hangs without argument, and the mind can drift the way cloth drifts on a line slowly, gently, without needing to arrive anywhere in particular. It's a small and slightly suspicious thing how quickly a household can change shape after a sentence is spoken. Not a thunder sentence, not a poet's sentence. Just a practical one, the kind of phrase that sounds like it was designed for tired people with lists. And then, suddenly, a room that used to feel shared becomes a room that feels occupied. The same lamp sits there, the same tiles hold the same coolness. But someone has moved a cup. Someone has taken a key. Someone has decided quietly that the blanket belongs on that side now and not this one. It's the gentlest form of history, the rearrangement of ordinary objects. In Roman life, this rearrangement could happen with unsettling smoothness, because the law, at least in its simplest form, treated many marriages less like a sacred chain and more like a social arrangement that could be unfastened. That doesn't mean people didn't care. It just means the system was built to keep functioning even when feelings were not doing their best work. Rome loved continuity. Rome loved households that kept producing dinners and airs and public appearances, regardless of private complexity. So when a couple unmarried, the city didn't stop. The street vendors didn't pause to reflect. The fountains continued to do their patient fountain business. The neighbors simply adjusted their assumptions, which is something humans can do with impressive speed, especially if they have gossip to organize. The first quiet shift is usually physical. Doors, locks, storage chests, little bundles of cloth tied with string. Roman houses were full of thresholds, literal and social, and after a separation, thresholds become suddenly meaningful. A husband might remain in the same domus, in the same neighborhood, with the same clients coming in the morning, while the wife's things begin to migrate. Or the wife might stay, depending on the household and the arrangement, while someone else becomes the person who is not here anymore. Rome could be flexible on the outside, while being extremely rigid about who counted as inside a family unit. The city had a talent for keeping the paperwork calm, even when the hallway felt awkward. And it wasn't only clothing and jewelry that mattered. It was the invisible property of routine. Who sits where at meals? Who receives which visitors? Who gives orders to which slaves? Who controls the keys to the storeroom? Which sounds like a tiny detail until you realize the storeroom contains the olive oil. And olive oil is basically the bloodstream of Roman domestic life. A household might carry on, but it carries on differently, like a familiar song played at a slightly different tempo. You still recognize it, you just notice the change in your bones. If you're still awake while we're quietly cataloging keys in oil jars, you can subscribe if you want. Or don't. The Romans would understand. They also signed up for things, but they called it patronage, and it came with obligations and slightly more sandals. Either way, stay as long as your eyelids feel generous. We're going to move slowly through what happens after the sentence, how new lives begin in extremely unromantic ways, and how old shadows linger in the corners like dust you swear you cleaned, but somehow it returns. One reason the after mattered so much is that Roman marriage was tangled up with property. Not always dramatically, often in a quiet, contractual way that feels like someone tried to make love compatible with accounting. The dowry is the most famous example. A dowry wasn't just a romantic gesture from a family saying, "Good luck with the marriage." It was a transfer of wealth meant to support the household and, ideally, stabilize the union. It could be cash, land, valuable items, or a mix. And when a marriage ended, the question of the dowry didn't vanish. It simply became a new, calmer question. What returns, when, and under what conditions? You can imagine the scene without needing any drama. A small group of people standing in a courtyard. A trusted messenger with a tablet, a seal. A witness who looks mildly bored because he has witnessed 3 things today already and would like to go home. Someone recites the necessary words or confirms the necessary notice. Someone nods. The system recognizes the separation, and then, almost immediately, someone begins thinking about inventory. The law might allow a marriage to end quickly, but money has never been famous for leaving quietly. The dowry might be returned to the woman or her family, especially if the marriage was ending without some officially recognized reason to keep part of it back. And yes, there were reasons and rules about deductions, sometimes tied to alleged misconduct, sometimes tied to children, sometimes tied to practical claims about expenses. It's a little like a calm argument over a security deposit, except the apartment is a marriage, and the damages are socially complicated. The language could be dry. The deadlines could be formal. And in the middle of it all is a very human truth. Even if the sentence ends the marriage, the household still needs to decide who keeps the nice bronze lamp. Roman social life also meant that separation was not only a private matter. It was visible. Not always publicly announced like a festival, but visible in the way daily life is visible. People notice patterns. They notice which litter arrived at which house. They noticed who attended which dinner. They noticed whether invitations stopped arriving like a faucet being turned off. Rome was a city of crowds and close living, and even the wealthy couldn't fully hide the fact that their households were busy little theaters. The house, in a way, always had an audience. Even if the audience was just the doorkeeper and 2 neighbors and a child who happened to be standing there at the exact wrong time. This visibility mattered because status mattered. For elites, marriage was often political. Divorce could be strategic. Alliances could be rewritten. New marriages could be arranged with impressive speed, as if the city were trying to demonstrate how efficiently it could move people around like pieces on a board. That speed can sound cold to modern ears, but it wasn't always about coldness. Sometimes it was simply about how the system was designed. Families were networks, and networks were maintained through marriages, the way roads are maintained through repairs. You don't stop using the road because the last repair was inconvenient. You just patch it and keep moving. For non-elites, the aftermath could be more practical and less theatrical, but still heavy in its own quiet way. Security mattered. Support mattered. A person leaving a household without strong family backing might face economic uncertainty or social suspicion or both. The law could be simple on paper, but social reality has always been more textured. A separation might be legally straightforward, but you still have to live somewhere. You still have to eat. You still have to exist in a neighborhood where people remember you. And memory, in Rome, had a way of attaching itself to names. Family names carried reputations like invisible luggage. So even after the marriage ended, the old association could linger. People might keep calling you so-and-so's wife in their heads for a while, even when the legal tie was gone. Rome was good at formal boundaries, but the mind doesn't always update as fast as a document does. A person can be legally unbound and still socially tethered for months or years by other people's habits of thought, which is one of the quiet costs of simple endings. The paperwork moves faster than the whispers. Inside the household, the smallest things become symbolic without anyone meaning them to. A chair that used to be used by one person becomes used by another. A servant who used to bring water to both now brings it to one. A doorway that used to feel normal now feels like a border. And because Romans were practical, they often tried to manage these shifts with procedures. Household roles might be reassigned. A steward might take on different responsibilities. A friend might be asked to mediate. It's not glamorous, It's just administration, the thing that quietly holds human life together like stitching. There's also the question of children, which Rome handled with its usual mixture of structure and social complexity. Children were tied to family lines and paternal authority in many contexts. A separation did not erase parenthood, but it could reshape daily living arrangements. A child might remain in the father's household, especially if the father's authority and household structure were dominant. But each situation could vary based on class, circumstance, and the informal power a family could exert. And in that variation, you can see the way law interacts with reality. The rules are there, but life is always negotiating around them like water around stones. The interesting thing about Rome is that the city could normalize rapid endings, while still maintaining strong ideas about dignity, reputation, and the image of stability. That means that after a separation, people often worked carefully to manage appearances. Not in a panicked way, in a steady way. The household might continue hosting dinners. The person might continue attending public events. The hair might be arranged as usual. The clothing might remain proper. The point wasn't necessarily to deceive. It was to maintain continuity, because continuity was a form of power. If you could keep your household running smoothly, you looked competent. And competence in Rome was a kind of moral virtue all on its own. Sometimes the aftermath included remarriage, and that is where the Roman ability to move on can feel especially brisk. A person might remarry for alliances, for children, for economic support, for social positioning. The speed was not always joyful. It was often logistical. Think of it like a very important calendar being updated. The old appointment is canceled. The next appointment is scheduled. The city nods. The household adjusts. And the lamps keep burning. But even with practical efficiency, old shadows stayed. Not in a dramatic, haunting sense. More like the way a scent lingers in a room after someone leaves. A separation could leave behind shared friends who now had to choose which invitations to accept. It could leave behind servants who remembered old routines and had to pretend they didn't. It could leave behind a neighbor who keeps asking gentle questions that are not really questions. And it could leave behind legal and financial threads that take time to untangle, because wealth moves slowly when it is wrapped in pride, paperwork, and family interest. There were also moral judgments that hovered around separation, depending on era and social circle. Rome's attitudes changed over time, and different authors and moralists complained about different things, often in the soothingly predictable way that moralists always complain. Sometimes they framed frequent divorce as evidence of decline. Sometimes they framed it as a symptom of luxury. Sometimes they simply used it as a convenient way to say people were better in the old days, which is a timeless hobby. But daily practice often continued regardless of what someone wrote. People lived, people separated, people remarried, and someone, somewhere, continued to grumble about it as if grumbling were a civic duty. In the quietest corners of this topic is the physical sensation of endings that are not ceremonially marked. In many cultures, marriage begins with a moment, a ceremony, a feast, a public recognition. Rome could have ceremonies and celebrations, certainly, but the ending could be as simple as words and witnesses and a step away. That can create an odd emotional geometry, even if we keep it calm and undramatic here. A beginning can be loud, and an ending can be quiet, and the mind sometimes struggles with that mismatch. It is like closing a door without hearing it latch, and then spending the rest of the night wondering if it has truly shut. So people sought closure in small ways, not necessarily through speeches or tears, but through routine, returning dowry items, moving possessions, changing sleeping arrangements, altering daily schedules. These are not poetic acts, but they are concrete, and concrete things help the mind accept new shapes. If you move the chest, if you change the lock, if you assign a servant to a different corridor, if you stop setting out 2 cups, The household learns, slowly, what the law already declared in a sentence. If you listen very closely, you can almost hear how much of Roman history is made out of these tiny transitions. Not the Senate, not the legions, just the low domestic sounds, sandals on tile, a curtain pulled aside, a wax tablet being put away, a door closing carefully so it doesn't wake anyone. A person might walk through the atrium in the morning and notice that the air feels the same, but the shape of the household has changed by one person's absence. And in a city that loved structure, the household would keep moving because keeping moving was what households were for. And still, the old shadows remain in the most boring places, in the record kept by a family, in the way someone says a name, in the way a friend hesitates before inviting you somewhere, in the way a servant pauses and then corrects themselves. Shadows are not always scary. Sometimes they're just evidence that something used to be there, something used to fit, and now it fits differently, so let the scene stay quiet. Let the lamp stay low. Let the street outside keep making its soft night sounds, footsteps, distant voices, a cartwheel somewhere behaving like a cartwheel. Inside, the household settles into its new arrangement, not with a grand ending, just with a slow acceptance of changed routines. Someone folds cloth, someone sets down a cup, someone checks a latch twice, not because they are afraid, but because habits persist. And the night, patient as always, holds the words without insisting on anything more. You might not expect a marriage to end the way a receipt ends, with a short line of words and a quiet pause for witnesses. But Rome had a talent for turning very human situations into tidy, repeatable procedures. A latch clicks. Sandals hush on tile. Somewhere a small lamp flame leans in a draft as if it's listening too. And in the softest voice you can imagine, just to keep things gentle, I'll ask the usual sleepy question: where and what time are you listening from? In ancient Rome, marriage often lived less inside a single grand ceremony and more inside the everyday behavior of a household. The shared bed, the shared meals, the shared reputation, which is really the heaviest piece of furniture in the room, even if you can't see it. A couple became real because other people treated them as real families, neighbors, servants, friends, and the wider social map that Rome was always updating. It is a little like how a group chat becomes official the moment everyone starts using it, except in Rome, the group chat was a courtyard, and the notifications were human beings standing too close. That's part of why separation could feel strangely simple on paper. If marriage is partly social recognition, then in a very Roman way it can be undone socially too. No thunder. No priests required. No dramatic courtyard sprinting unless you personally enjoy sprinting. What mattered was that the change could be seen, understood, and most importantly proved. Rome loved proof the way some people love organizing drawers, not because it's romantic, but because it makes the world feel less slippery. And so you get the famous idea that a marriage could end with a clear statement of intent. The sentence itself is often summarized in modern retellings as something like, "Take your things and go." It's not a love poem. It's not even a particularly creative breakup line. It's more like a door label. The point is not beauty. The point is clarity. A single sentence matters because it draws a line a community can recognize, before and after. And if it's said in the right way, with the right witnesses or the right delivery, the door swings shut and the city continues breathing as if nothing in particular has happened. If you are still awake while we read calmly discussing the legal power of one short sentence, you can subscribe. Or don't. I promise I won't take it personally, because I'm going to be busy thinking about dowries and lamps and other famously unexciting objects. If you do subscribe, though, it would be very ramen of you joining a long-term social arrangement with minimal emotion and a quiet nod. Even when divorce looked simple in theory, Romans still cared about evidence. Not because they were dramatic, but because shame and money tend to follow endings like small, persistent dogs. A separation that isn't provable is the kind that turns into arguments later. And Rome, being a practical place full of practical lawsuits, tried to prevent that. A message delivered by a trusted person, a spoken declaration in front of witnesses, a record kept by a family. These become legal anchors, and Roman law and custom were full of these anchors, small weights meant to keep the future from drifting into confusion. You can imagine the scene without raising your heartbeat. Someone stands under a lamp, and the lamp is not impressed. A friend is present because friends are useful for many things, including making a moment official without any fireworks. A messenger might carry the words, because sometimes the clearest way to end something is to have someone else deliver the clarity while you stay home and adjust your furniture. The goal is not drama. The goal is that neither side can pretend later that the break never happened. A calm procedure protects you from future accusations, which is often the real fear sitting quietly behind the curtain. And then, once the sentence has done its job, the truly Roman part begins, the accounting. The dowry was the quiet heartbeat of many Roman marriages because it connected romance, if we're being generous, to contracts and inheritance. It was wealth brought into the marriage, usually from the wife's family, meant to support the household and, in a way, support the stability of the union. It could be land, cash, jewelry, valuable objects, or a mixture that sounds like someone packed for a long trip and brought just-in-case items. When a marriage ended, the dowry didn't evaporate into the night air. There were expectations about its return, timelines, and conditions, and these could vary with time, social class, and circumstances. Sometimes parts could be withheld in certain situations. Sometimes arguments could arise about expenses, children, or behavior. It's a bit like a security deposit dispute, except the apartment is a household, and the witnesses are your neighbors, and the gods are politely not getting involved. So the sentence ends the union, but the negotiations can last longer. The truly sleepy irony is that the most dramatic human change, two people deciding they are no longer together, can be followed by the least dramatic activities imaginable: counting, listing, verifying, and quietly disagreeing about who keeps what. In Rome, a midnight divorce could be followed by daylight arguments over clothing, slaves, land boundaries, and obligations. The words may be quick, but the paperwork likes to take its time. As the household adjusts, it's the little things that shift first: keys, storage chests, access to the pantry. The household's oil jars. If you've never thought about olive oil as a symbol of domestic power, Rome would like you to consider it now, slowly, with sleepy seriousness. Whoever controls the oil controls a small portion of daily life. Lamps burn, food cooks. Skin is rubbed with it. It is the most boring kind of influence, which is still influence. And Rome, being Rome, cared not only about what happened, but about what could be shown to have happened. So witnesses matter, tokens matter, written notes matter. Even in a culture that often valued spoken declarations, documentation could appear: wax tablets, letters, family records. The goal is clarity. The goal is to reduce the number of future scenes where two relatives stand in a doorway arguing while someone's dog looks confused. Now, as we drift deeper into the quiet aftermath, we should notice something that Rome noticed constantly. Not everyone could leave equally. In elite Rome, divorce could be common and even strategic, used to rewrite alliances and reset careers, like changing a cloak when the weather changes. But ease depends on protection, family support, wealth, the ability to survive gossip. A person with a strong household behind them can leave quietly. A person without that shield risks isolation. So the law's simplicity can hide a social reality that is heavier and uneven, even if we keep talking about it in this soft, gentle tone. For the powerful, the story can look deceptively smooth. A separation happens, a new marriage is arranged. Dinner parties continue. Invitations shift slightly. The city nods and moves on. For the less protected, the same legal possibility might feel like standing on a wide road with no sandals. Where do you go next? Who supports you? Who speaks for you if someone challenges your claim? Rome was a city full of systems, but systems always feel friendlier to people who already have a place inside them. And then there is the house itself, which in Rome was often more public than we like to admit. Roman life could make privacy feel thin, especially for women watched by family and neighbors, and for anyone whose household depended on a public reputation. The house was a stage, and the audience was not always seated politely. Servants whisper. Friends choose sides in quiet ways. Invitations stop arriving. People learn new ways to say your name or to avoid saying it at all, which is a very old human skill. A separation might happen at night, but its echo appears in the morning. The doorkeeper stands at the entrance doing his job, and now his job includes knowing who is supposed to be admitted and who is not. Someone who once walked in without question now becomes a question. The household isn't only ending a relationship, it's renegotiating its place in the social map. And the map remembers because maps are rude that way. Rome also remembered through habit. People might keep thinking of someone as so-and-so's wife, even after the legal tie is gone, because minds update slowly, like old tablets being scraped and reused. The law can draw a clean line, but gossip draws softer lines that overlap and smudge. A person can be legally unbound and still socially tethered for a while by other people's stubborn imagination. After the sentence, the household shifts immediately. Rooms change, keys move. Routines break like dry reeds, quietly and without applause. Sometimes the split is peaceful, sometimes it is tense, but either way, the emptiness feels practical and sharp. And Rome's strange efficiency in endings meant that people could remarry quickly, especially in circles where marriages were treated like bridges between families. But emotional dust doesn't settle on command, even in Rome. A door can close in one moment, yet the mind keeps hearing it. The quiet costs of settling appear later in boring ways. You might see them in a dinner where someone's name is not mentioned. You might see them in the way a friend hesitates before choosing which household to visit on a holiday. You might see them in a servant's awkward pause, the tiny silence where a habit almost speaks before being corrected. Families may agree in public and still carry private resentments that leak out years later in smaller conflicts. Peace exists, but it is often a careful peace, maintained like a lamp flame sheltered from drafts. And there is something else that lingers, the feeling that simplicity does not always mean kindness. Rome's system could be swift, legible, and procedural. That can sound merciful compared to endless feuds, but procedure is not the same as comfort. It's the difference between a cleanly folded sheet and a warm one. The law can fold the situation neatly, but it cannot always warm it. Now, because this is bedtime history and we're not going to chase drama into the streets, let's settle into the final image the way a tired mind settles into a pillow. Imagine the moment after a settlement, the pouch tied shut, the witnesses nodding, the household trying to breathe normally again, as if breath itself is a routine that must be restored, the lamp turned low, the sentence spoken without shouting. The air suddenly colder, not because the gods are angry, but because the room has rearranged its meaning. Hold the thought that simple doesn't mean painless. It only means legible to law. Legible is a very Roman compliment. It means the city can understand what happened, and the city can file it away, and the neighbors can adjust their assumptions without pulling a muscle. But inside the house, the feelings are allowed to be slow, because feelings always are. The law has done what it can turn a hot instinct into a colder, controlled ending. Not erase the heat, not heal the burn, just keep it from spreading across the whole neighborhood. Outside, the street stays silent in its usual Roman way. Somewhere a cartwheel complains softly. Somewhere a dog decides that this is a good hour to exist. Somewhere a fountain continues its steady work, which is to keep doing what it does, no matter what two humans have decided about each other. And inside, the latch holds. The household adjusts. The last feeling softens, not into a conclusion, but into a quiet acceptance that the door is closed and tomorrow will arrive anyway. The night keeps the words. The lamp keeps its small, patient flame. The tiles keep their coolness. And if the mind wants to drift, it can drift on these ordinary details. The keys, the oil, the witnesses, the unremarkable sentence that changes the shape of a life and then sits there, quietly as if it has always belonged to the room.